there is this really profound, lingering silence in the world today that almost no one ever stops to listen to.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
Right. And I want you, listening to this deep dive right now, to try and imagine imagine a complete total void where universal ancient dread just used to sit.
Hmm.
Because for over 3,000 years, every single one of your ancestors lived with a specific, inescapable terror. I mean, it dictated how they built their cities, how they traveled, even how they loved their children.
It touched literally every.
Exactly. And yet, you have never once felt it. You enjoy a safety so absolute, so structurally baked into modern existence that you probably don't even know the name of this terror well enough to miss it.
Right.
We live in this bubble of total security from one of the most lethal forces in planetary history, and we've entirely forgotten to be grateful for it.
Well, that blind spot is actually a really fascinating side effect of absolute victory.
How so?
Because when public health works perfectly, the result is literally nothing.
Right.
Nothing happens. No one gets sick, no one panics, the hospitals remain quiet, and because of that quiet, we lose our collective memory of what the battlefield looked like when the war was actually raging.
Which brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. We are pulling from a massive stack of source material today, historical archives, medical journals, epidemiological reports, all to reconstruct the eradication of smallpox.
A campaign that was officially declared complete in 1980.
Yes, 1980. And we are going to unpack how a deeply fractured humanity, locked in this, existential standoff of the Cold War, managed to pool its resources and completely erase its oldest, deadliest enemy off the face of the earth.
And then how we subsequently managed to forget the sheer staggering magnitude of that achievement.
Yeah. And honestly, the word achievement almost feels too small for what the source material describes here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is not just some medical milestone or an interesting footnote in 20th century history. We are talking about the ultimate case study in human cooperation. It remains the singular instance in the entire history of our species where we intentionally, systematically drove a human disease to absolute zero.
Just to establish the scale of what we are dealing with here, because the sources provide this epidemiological statistic that just forces you to pause and recalibrate your entire understanding of history.
It really does.
In the 20th century alone, smallpox killed an estimated 300 million people. 300 million.
Yeah. Human brains are simply not wired to process numbers that large.
No, they aren't.
I mean, 300 million fatalities within a single century turns a disease from a medical issue into like a geologic force.
Right. It's just a force of nature at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we look at the raw data in the sources, we aren't just looking at the deadliest disease in history. We are looking at this unseen arithmetic that altered the trajectory of human civilization every single day.
Okay, let's unpack that arithmetic, because the sources state that the physical evidence of this virus goes back at least 3,000 years.
Minimum, yeah.
We've even found the distinct physical markers of it on Egyptian mummies.
Right, including Pharaoh Ramses.
Ramses V, yeah. But the statistic that completely stops me in my tracks is the fatality rate, a 30% kill rate.
30%.
My question is, how does a society economically, structurally, culturally even continue to function when an entity with a 30% kill rate is constantly circulating in the background?
It's hard to fathom.
You are talking about a scenario where almost 1 out of every 3 people who contract this virus just dies.
Well, a 30% fatality rate fundamentally changes the architecture of a society.
Yeah.
When an outbreak swept through a village or an early urban center, the demographic collapse was immediate. You would lose agricultural workers, tradespeople, local leadership, all within a matter of weeks.
It just hollows out the community.
Exactly. But to understand the true societal impact, we have to look beyond just the immediate death toll. For the roughly 70% who actually survived the infection, the biological aftermath was often catastrophic.
Right. The sources mention the long-term effects.
The virus heavily targeted the eyes, making it one of the leading causes of global blindness for centuries.
So you have a massive influx of survivors who now require lifelong care in societies that barely have surplus resources to begin with.
And that is compounded by the severe physical scarring.
The pockmarks.
Right. The deep, permanent pockmarks covering the face and body were a ubiquitous feature of human populations everywhere. You'd see it constantly.
But perhaps the most profound detail in the historical sources, at least for me, is the psychological toll.
The naming tradition.
Yes. The ubiquitous nature of this virus meant that in many cultures, across different continents and centuries, parents engaged in this heartbreaking defensive mechanism.
Yeah.
They wouldn't formally name a newborn child until that child had contracted smallpox and survived it.
It is a staggering detail to sit with.
It really is. I mean, the statistical probability of a child being taken by this virus was so overwhelming that parents had to withhold the most basic human act of naming them.
You essentially couldn't consider a child a permanent part of the community until they had passed through this biological gauntlet.
It was an expected, almost mandatory phase of human existence.
And you have to remember, smallpox was a remarkably democratic killer.
Meaning it didn't discriminate.
Exactly. The virus operated purely on biological vulnerability, meaning it completely bypassed all human constructs of class, wealth, and power.
Right, the sources list monarchs like Queen Mary II and Tsar Peter II as casualties.
Yes. All the royal guards, castles, and wealth in the world provided absolutely zero defense against transmission.
And if the virus didn't care about class, it certainly didn't care about geography either.
Not at all.
The sources spend a lot of time detailing the global reach of the virus, particularly its role in the Columbian Exchange. When European explorers and colonists began crossing the Atlantic, they brought this virus to the Americas.
And this is where we see the mechanics of a virgin soil epidemic.
Virgin soil epidemic, right. Unpack that for us.
So, the indigenous populations of the Americas had been geographically isolated for thousands of years. They possessed absolutely zero inherited generational immunity to the virus.
Like none.
None. So when smallpox was introduced, it didn't just cause outbreaks. It triggered cascading societal collapse.
It's hard to visualize what that actually looks like on the ground. A societal collapse driven just by a virus.
Consider the biological logistics of it.
Okay.
In a population with some endemic history of a virus, the older generations might have immunity, so they can care for the sick, harvest the crops, and maintain the community structure while the young recover.
Because they've already had it and survived.
Exactly. But in a virgin soil scenario, everybody falls ill at the exact same time.
Oh, wow.
There is literally no one left to draw water, no one to tend the fires, no one to harvest the food. Entire civilizations were hollowed out.
Just erased.
The demographic erasure of indigenous American peoples occurred at a speed and scale that outpaced any conquering army.
To put that 300 million deaths in the 20th century into perspective, and the sources indicate it might have even been closer to 500 million in its last 100 years.
Yeah, the estimates vary, but they are all massive.
I keep trying to find a parallel. The 20th century is arguably the bloodiest century in recorded history. They had World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War.
Right.
Smallpox killed more people than all the wars of the 20th century combined.
Let that sink in.
We essentially had this invisible biological world war raging every single day, and the casualties were just an accepted part of the background noise of life.
And for thousands of years, all humanity could do was endure those casualties. We had no systemic way to fight back until the very late 18th century.
Which is where the timeline of the source material begins to shift, right?
Right.
From pure tragedy to the very earliest stages of resistance.
Exactly.
So how do we get from enduring this invisible world war to actually fielding a defense? The sources point heavily to 1796 and a man named Edward Jenner.
Yes.
But before we get to Jenner, the text briefly mentions that people were already trying some pretty desperate measures to build immunity before a vaccine even existed.
They were, through a deeply risky process called variolation.
For
Right. Long before Jenner, people in various parts of the world, from Asia to the Middle East, realized one crucial thing. If you survived smallpox, you never caught it again.
You had lifelong immunity.
Exactly. So they attempted to induce a mild case of the disease intentionally.
Which sounds insane.
It was very risky. They would take material from a smallpox patient, usually the fluid or scabs from a pustule, and introduce it into a healthy person.
How did they do that?
Sometimes by scratching it into their skin or having them actually inhale dried, powdered scabs.
Wait, they inhaled dried scabs. That sounds like playing Russian roulette with biology. You are actively infecting yourself with a lethal virus and just hoping your body fights it off quickly enough to only give you a mild case.
It was a massive gamble. While the fatality rate of variolation was much lower than a natural infection, perhaps 1% to 2% compared to that 30%.
That's still a 1 in 50 chance of dying.
Right. And worse, people who were variolated could still spark full-blown outbreaks because they were shedding live, fully lethal smallpox virus.
Oh, because they actually had the real disease.
Exactly. It was a desperate measure for desperate times.
Which perfectly sets the stage for why Jenner's 1796 breakthrough was so monumental. The sources mention he used cowpox to immunize people.
Can you walk through the biological mechanics of what Jenner actually discovered?
Sure.
Like, why would a virus from a cow protect a human from smallpox?
It really comes down to a brilliant piece of observational epidemiology. Jenner noticed a pattern in rural agricultural communities.
Okay.
Milkmaids, who spent their days working closely with cows, frequently contracted a mild occupational disease called cowpox.
Hence the cows.
Right. They would get a few sores on their hands, feel mildly ill for a few days, and then completely recover. But the crucial observation was that these milkmaids never seemed to catch smallpox when an outbreak rolled through the region.
So they just had some sort of invisible armor.
Exactly. Biologically, the cowpox virus and the smallpox virus are closely related cousins within the orthopox virus family.
Okay, cousin. They share a very similar structural shape. Jenner theorized that if he deliberately infected a person with a mild cowpox virus, it would teach their body how to fight off the deadly smallpox virus.
Because the body recognizes the shape.
Yes. He tested this theory by taking material from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid's hand and scratching it into the arm of a young boy.
A very 18th century way of doing clinical trials.
Very different ethics back then, yes.
Yeah.
But later, he exposed the boy to smallpox, and the boy did not fall ill.
Wow. The immune system had seen the cousin virus, learned the shape of the biological key, and was ready when the real threat arrived.
Precise.
And I noticed a great piece of etymology in the sources here. Jenner called his new method vaccination, deriving it directly from vacca, which is the Latin word for cow.
It was an absolute paradigm shift in human medicine. Suddenly, you didn't have to risk a 2% chance of dying from variolation just to get immunity.
Right, you could use a safe, mild proxy virus.
Exactly. However, when reading the source material, we have to carefully temper this victory. There is a massive operational difference between possessing a tool to control a disease and possessing the capacity to end it.
Because even with the cowpox vaccine, smallpox didn't just vanish in the 19th century. We had the weapon, but the casualty numbers were still astronomical.
That's right. For over 150 years after Jenner's discovery, the vaccine was utilized primarily as a defensive shield.
A shield, not a sword.
It was a tool of containment. If a public health department detected an outbreak in a city, they would rush in, vaccinate as many people in the immediate vicinity as they could reach, and then basically wait for the viral fire to burn itself out.
The fire always came back.
Always. Because the virus was still deeply entrenched in populations all over the globe, particularly in areas with less infrastructure.
So it's hiding.
Yes, the disease was pushed out of certain wealthy enclaves, but it was still circulating aggressively, still mutating slightly, and still killing millions of people annually. Humanity had built a wall, but the threat was constantly probing that wall for weaknesses.
So for a century and a half, we were just locked in a holding pattern.
A deadly holding pattern.
We're playing defense. We were managing the casualties rather than striking at the source. This shifts the narrative to the mid-20th century.
Right.
We have this defensive shield, but as the global population explodes and urbanization pushes millions of people into dense cities, the virus has more hosts. It's moving faster than the local public health systems can manage. The defensive strategy is buckling.
The math of containment was failing on a global scale, and this forces the international health community into a corner. They realized that as long as smallpox existed anywhere on Earth, it was a threat everywhere on Earth.
This is where the story gets incredibly audacious, the shift from a defensive posture to an offensive one.
Yes, going on the attack.
The sources talk about the concept of eradication, not just reducing the death toll, not just keeping it out of North America and Europe, but driving a human disease to absolute zero everywhere, forever.
It was a proposal that bordered on scientific heresy at the time.
Really? Heresy?
While prominent health officials thought it was a utopian fantasy. The idea that you could track down every single chain of transmission of a highly contagious respiratory virus across a planet of billions of people was viewed as logistically impossible.
And the geopolitical origins of this push make it even more unlikely. I mean, the formal proposal didn't originate from Western pharmaceutical companies or American diplomats.
No, it didn't.
The sources show it began in 1958 at the World Health Assembly, driven by a proposal from a Soviet representative named Viktor Zdanov.
The context of 1958 is critical here. The Soviet Union steps up to the international podium and formally proposes the complete eradication of smallpox.
Right in the middle of the Cold War.
Exactly. Now, the USSR had largely eliminated the disease within its own borders through mandatory vaccination, but they were constantly dealing with imported cases from neighboring regions.
So they kept having to fight it off.
Right. Zhanov argued that it was economically and scientifically absurd to keep vaccinating entire generations of humans just to maintain a defensive wall. The only logical solution was to go on the offensive.
So the Soviet Union pitches this idea to a deeply divided world. And from the text, it seems it took almost a decade for the global community to stop debating and actually organize a coordinated response.
Bureaucracy moves slowly.
It does. The World Health Organization didn't officially launch its intensified eradication program until 1967.
And that 1967 launch, which was actually placed under the direction of an American epidemiologist named D.A. Henderson, was the turning point.
But we need to look at the baseline numbers from that year to understand the sheer cliff face they were trying to climb.
It was daunting.
This wasn't a virus that was naturally fading into obscurity. In 1967, the WHO estimated there were still around 10 to 15 million smallpox cases occurring annually,
Resulting in more than 2 million deaths every single year.
spread across roughly 30 endemic countries. 2 million deaths a year, scattered across dozens of nations.
And this is where I have to look at the logistics and question the fundamental feasibility of their plan, just like the critics did.
Right. If I'm an epidemiologist looking at a global map in 1967, the mathematics of eradication seem completely unworkable.
How so?
Well, to achieve zero, the traditional thinking was that you had to vaccinate roughly 80 to 100% of the global population to achieve herd immunity.
That was the accepted doctrine.
How do you find the funding, the cold storage, and the sheer manpower to vaccinate billions of people, including nomadic populations in the Sahara, uncontacted groups in the Amazon, and people living in active war zones?
You've identified the exact logistical wall that the early eradication campaign crashed into. They quickly discovered that a strategy based on mass universal vaccination was failing.
It just couldn't scale.
Exactly. In dense countries like India, the population was growing faster than the public health workers could vaccinate them. They would achieve 80% coverage in a region, and smallpox would just continue to spread among the remaining 20%.
Because the virus was just that efficient.
Too efficient. Mass vaccination was financially and physically unsustainable.
So if trying to give the vaccine to everyone on Earth is a mathematical dead end, how do you pivot? The sources introduce a critical strategic shift spearheaded by an epidemiologist named William Foge.
Foge's insight absolutely revolutionized the campaign. He was working in Western Africa when a severe vaccine shortage forced him to abandon the mass vaccination approach.
He literally ran out of supplies.
He couldn't vaccinate everyone, so he had to be surgical. This led to the development of a strategy called surveillance and containment, which later became widely known as ring vaccination.
Ring vaccination. The way the source material describes it, it feels exactly like the strategy used to fight a massive forest fire.
That's a great comparison.
Right. If millions of acres of wilderness are burning, you don't call in helicopters and attempt to drop water on every single inch of the forest. You don't have enough water, and the fire moves too fast.
So what do?
Instead, you send spotters to find the active fire line. Once you locate the flames, you dig a fire break around it. You remove the combustible fuel in a ring ahead of the fire, so when the flames reach that barrier, they have nothing left to burn and the fire just starves.
That is a highly accurate mechanical analogy for what Foge and the WHO implemented.
Okay.
The fuel in this scenario is human susceptibility, and the fire break is targeted immunity. The success of ring vaccination hinged on two distinct phases.
What's the first phase?
First, you need an incredibly sensitive surveillance network. You cannot wait for data to trickle into a hospital. You have to actively hunt for the virus. The WHO implemented a system of rewards, paying locals to report cases of the distinct smallpox rash.
So that's finding the active fire.
Exactly. Once a case was verified, the containment phase began immediately. Health workers would isolate the infected individual. Then they would engage in rapid, aggressive contact tracing.
Which we are all very familiar with now.
Right. They would identify every single person that the patient had interacted with over the previous weeks, family members, neighbors, people at the market, and vaccinate them all. This formed the first ring of immunity.
But the virus might have already jumped to one of those contacts before they were vaccinated, right?
Which is why the protocol required a second ring.
Ah.
The teams would trace the contacts of the contacts. They were mathematically predicting the path of the virus and building a biological wall ahead of it. If the virus attempted to transmit, it hit a vaccinated host and the chain was broken.
So you didn't need to vaccinate 100% of a country.
You just need to vaccinate the 100 people immediately surrounding every single active virus.
It's an incredibly smart surgical approach. It solves the mathematical problem of trying to vaccinate billions of people.
It does on paper, yes.
Right, because reading through the sources, a brilliant strategy on paper still has to survive the brutal physical realities of the field. And the sources highlight two specific pieces of mundane technology that made this strategy physically possible in the most unforgiving environments on Earth.
The strategy would have completely failed without them. The first major hurdle was the delivery mechanism.
Meaning the needle.
Right. Traditional glass and metal syringes were an operational nightmare in remote areas. They required constant sterilization, boiling water, replacement parts, and a high degree of medical training to administer an injection properly without causing secondary infections.
Because you can't drag a sterilizing autoclave through a jingle on a donkey.
Exactly.
So what replaced the traditional syringe? The sources mention a tool called the bifurcated needle.
The bifurcated needle is honestly one of the most consequential pieces of humble engineering in medical history.
It really is.
Developed by Wyeth Laboratories, it doesn't look like a syringe at all. It's essentially a small, sturdy piece of steel wire about 2 inches long, with the tip split into two tiny prongs, like a very small fork.
But how does a tiny fork deliver a precise medical dose?
Through the physics of capillary action.
Oh, like how water moves up a plant stem.
Precisely. When a health worker dips the bifurcated needle into a vial of vaccine, the liquid is drawn up and held perfectly in the tiny space between the two prongs. It automatically pulls up exactly the right fraction of a drop of vaccine every single time. There is no measuring, no plunger, no calibration.
That eliminates the dosage errors completely.
It does. Then, to administer the vaccine, the worker doesn't inject it deep into the muscle. They hold the needle perpendicular to the patient's arm and rapidly puncture the top layer of the skin about 15 times in just a few seconds.
Sounds painful, but effective.
It barely draws a trace of blood. The simplicity of this tool was its true power. It cost pennies to manufacture, it could be sterilized simply by passing it through a flame, and most importantly, the WHO could train a local village volunteer to use it perfectly in roughly 10 minutes.
And that last point is the key to the entire logistics puzzle.
Huge.
You don't need a standing army of highly paid doctors or nurses. You can recruit teachers, religious leaders, and local volunteers right at the site of the outbreak, hand them a needle, and turn them into vaccinators immediately.
But that needle is totally useless if the liquid you are dipping it into is ruined.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second technological breakthrough, the freeze-dried, heat-stable vaccine.
I want to focus on this because the cold chain seems like an insurmountable barrier. If I understand the biology correctly, early liquid vaccines were highly unstable.
Very unstable.
They required constant refrigeration from the factory all the way into the patient's arm. If the temperature fluctuated, the live virus in the vaccine died, and you were essentially just injecting people with useless water.
The cold chain was the bane of tropical public health. Maintaining constant refrigeration across the Sahara Desert or during the monsoon season in Bangladesh is literally a logistical impossibility.
So what did they do?
The development of a freeze-dried vaccine changed the fundamental math of the campaign. Scientists figured out how to dehydrate the vaccine into a stable powder form.
So it bypasses the need for the cold chain entirely?
Yes. The powder could sit in a vial, in a backpack, in 100-degree heat for a month without losing its potency. When the health worker arrived at a remote village, they simply mixed the powder with a sterile, diluent liquid right before they needed it.
Wow.
These two tools, combined the heat-stable powder and the bifurcated needle, transformed a logistically impossible endeavor into a mission that was merely incredibly grueling.
And the sources paint a vivid picture of just how grueling that field work was. We're talking about an operation that mobilized hundreds of thousands of people, from the strategists at the WHO headquarters in Geneva to the local drivers, translators, and volunteer vaccinators.
An army.
They were hiking through treacherous mountain passes, wading through floodwaters in India, and negotiating passage through active civil war zones. They went door to door, searching for a microscopic enemy by looking for the rash it left behind, case by case. ring by ring.
It was an unprecedented mobilization. And when we zoom out to look at the broader political climate in which this massive global coordination occurred, we encounter what is perhaps the most extraordinary paradox of the entire eradication story.
This is the aspect of the historical record that simply astounds me. All of this sharing of resources, this beautiful moment of global unity where humanity links arms to save itself from a biological threat. It is happening during the absolute geopolitical nadir of the 20th century.
Yeah.
It is happening at the height of the Cold War.
Consider the timelines. The campaign is running through the 1960s and 1970s. We are talking about the era of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the proxy wars in Vietnam and across Africa, the escalating nuclear arms race.
Yeah.
The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in an ideological and military struggle for global dominance. The rhetoric at the highest levels of government was literally about mutually assured destruction.
The politicians are calculating the megatonnage required to incinerate each other's capitals, and yet the source material shows that the scientists and public health officials from these exact same superpowers are quietly, diligently working side by side.
It's wild.
How did they bypass the political red tape to actually share resources across the Iron Curtain?
It required a profound level of compartmentalization. The health officials essentially formed a parallel diplomatic channel. They argued successfully that a virus does not respect borders or political ideologies.
And the Soviets listened.
The Soviet Union stepped up and supplied an astonishing amount of the freeze-dried vaccine to the global effort, more than 1 billion doses over the lifespan of the campaign.
1 billion doses manufactured in Soviet labs being utilized in a global campaign that is being directed by an American, D.A. Henderson, out of the WHO offices in Geneva.
And they deployed field teams that included both American and Soviet epidemiologists working together in endemic countries.
While their governments were pointing missiles at each other.
Exactly. The political leaders in Washington and Moscow largely chose to look the other way. They gave the scientists the mandate and the funding and then stepped back to let them execute the mission. Economists and historians cited in the sources frequently referred to this as one of the greatest, if not the single greatest, achievements of international cooperation in human history.
You have two superpowers who cannot agree on the basic economic or political structure of reality, deciding that this 3,000-year-old biological lock needs to be broken, and they just put their heads down and do it. And reading through the timeline in the sources, you can see the ring vaccination strategy slowly, methodically closing the net on the virus. They cleared North America, they cleared Europe. Then they initiated massive block-by-block campaigns to verify that the transmission chains were permanently broken across South America.
The net tightened, pushing the virus out of its historical strongholds. But the end game was incredibly fraught. After South America, the WHO focused its immense resources on Asia, specifically the incredibly dense populations of India and Bangladesh.
The sheer volume of humanity there made surveillance exceedingly difficult. The virus could hide in plain sight.
The sources single out a specific moment in Asia that highlights how tight the net was getting. In October of 1975, in a village in Bangladesh, a 3-year-old girl named Rahima Banu was diagnosed with smallpox.
Her diagnosis triggered a massive, overwhelming WHO response. They threw a massive ring of vaccination around her village.
Yes, they did.
Rahima Banu survived the infection, and when she recovered, something deeply historical happened. She proved to be the absolute last natural case of variola major, the most lethal, most historically devastating strain of the virus anywhere on Earth.
Think about that.
When her immune system finally cleared the virus, that specific 30% kill rate variant went extinct in the wild.
It's incredible to think of an extinction event happening inside the immune system of a 3-year-old girl.
It is.
But the eradication wasn't fully complete, right? Because the sources indicate there was a milder strain of the virus still circulating.
Variola minor.
Right. The net had to be dragged across the globe one final time, leading the WHO to the last stronghold on Earth, the Horn of Africa.
The Horn of Africa, specifically Somalia and Ethiopia, presented severe logistical challenges due to harsh terrain, nomadic populations, and ongoing armed conflicts. This was the absolute grinding endgame.
The hardest part.
The WHO concentrated hundreds of field workers to hunt down the very last transmission chains of the milder strain, variola minor. And this immense effort culminates on October 26, 1977, in the coastal town of Merka, Somalia.
This brings us to a man named Ali Mal Malin, the very last natural case of smallpox in human history.
And what strikes me about his story in the sources is the deep, almost poetic irony of his situation. He wasn't an isolated nomad who had never heard of the vaccine. He was intimately connected to the medical field.
He was a cook at the local hospital in Merca, and he occasionally worked as a vaccinator for the smallpox eradication program itself.
Wait, really?
Yes, he was physically a part of the global army trying to extinguish the disease.
So how does a man working for the eradication program become its final casualty?
It comes down to basic human fear. Despite working around the campaign, Ollie had managed to avoid being vaccinated himself. He later admitted he was afraid the vaccination would be painful.
Oh, because of the 15 pokes with the needle.
Right. So when a vehicle arrived at the hospital carrying a smallpox patient, Ollie was asked to help guide the vehicle to the isolation camp. The trip took about 15 minutes. He was in an enclosed space with an active infection without the biological armor of the vaccine.
And that's all it took.
Shortly after, he developed the fever and the distinct rash.
The virus found the one unprotected lock left in the hospital. But the WHO's reaction to his diagnosis demonstrates exactly why the ring vaccination strategy was so effective. They didn't just put him in a room and hope for the best.
The response was absolute and overwhelming. When the WHO confirmed Ollie had smallpox, they treated it like a global biological emergency.
All hands on deck.
They initiated a massive contact tracing operation. Over the next few weeks, they vaccinated roughly 55,000 people in the immediate surrounding area.
55,000.
They built an impenetrable wall of immunity around it.
55,000 vaccines deployed for a single infected individual. That is the ultimate realization of surveillance and containment.
The virus had absolutely nowhere left to go. It attempted to shed and find a new host, but every potential target was shielded. Ali survived the infection. And when the last scab fell from his skin, an unbroken chain of biological transmission that had caused immeasurable human suffering for over 3 millennia was finally severed.
It is a moment that feels almost too large to comprehend.
Which is why we need to contextualize 1977. While health workers in Somalia were quietly breaking the final links of a 3,000-year-old biological chain, humanity's attention was elsewhere.
Oh, yes. The source notes a brilliant historical juxtaposition here.
I love this part.
In the summer of 1977, astronomers using a massive radio telescope in Ohio detected the famous "wow" signal. It was a strong, anomalous radio burst from deep space that many believed could be the first sign of extraterrestrial intelligence.
We were staring up at the cosmos.
Exactly, straining our ears to catch a whisper from the stars, entirely captivated by the future. And exactly at that same moment, down in the dust of Somalia, we finally, quietly defeated the oldest terror of our past.
It is a stunning contrast. But as we look at the timeline of the source material, we cannot jump straight from Somalia to the global celebrations. There is a grave, sobering coda to this story that highlights the sheer lethality of what we were dealing with.
The victory in Somalia was the end of the disease in the wild, but it was not the absolute final human casualty.
Right. The timeline details an event in 1978, a year after Ali Millen's recovery. It's a stark reminder that even when the virus was trapped behind glass, it was still a mortal threat.
In the summer of 1978, at a research laboratory at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, a tragic breach of containment occurred. The lab was authorized to hold smallpox samples for research purposes.
And through a failure in the ventilation system, the virus traveled through the ductwork and infected a medical photographer working on the floor above, a woman named Janet Parker.
She hadn't traveled to an endemic zone, she wasn't treating patients, she was just at work in a modern building in England.
Tragically, Janet Parker contracted a severe form of the disease and passed away in September 1978.
Her death triggered a massive local quarantine and vaccination effort in Birmingham, right?
Yes, to ensure the virus didn't escape back into the general population. It was a dark, heavy moment for the eradication campaign. It served as a definitive, brutal proof that as long as the virus existed anywhere, even in a secure laboratory, the threat remained.
It proved that the end game of eradication had to be absolute. Following the Birmingham outbreak, the WHO intensified their verification process. The sources detail how a global commission spent 2 years meticulously combing through data, verifying surveillance records, and ensuring that no hidden pockets of the virus remained. Which finally brings us to the formal declaration.
In December of 1979, the Global Commission officially certified that smallpox had been eradicated. And then on May 8, 1980, the World Health Assembly held a plenary meeting in Geneva and passed a resolution that formally declared the world and all its peoples had won their freedom from smallpox.
Won their freedom is such a precise, heavy phrase. They aren't talking about managing a healthcare metric. They're talking about liberation from a biological tyrant.
Absolutely.
And the sources provide a financial breakdown of this liberation that completely upends how we usually think about public spending.
If we strip away the incalculable human value of ending that suffering and look at it purely through an economic lens, the smallpox eradication campaign is arguably the single greatest financial investment in human history.
The numbers are staggering.
The sources indicate that the entire international effort, spanning over a decade, cost approximately $300 million.
$300 million. In the context of global budgets, that is a rounding error. That's the cost of a few modern fighter jets.
And the return on that investment is perpetual. Because the disease is gone, no nation has to spend money treating smallpox patients, managing quarantines, or running continuous, costly mass vaccination programs. Economists estimate that the eradication of smallpox saves the global economy more than $1 billion every single year.
Wow.
A one-time investment of $300 million yields a $1 billion dividend annually, forever.
Which naturally forces a very difficult question. If I look at this historical blueprint, if we prove that we possess the organizational capacity, the scientific knowledge, and the economic incentive to literally wipe a disease off the planetary map, why was smallpox the only one?
That's the obvious question.
Why haven't we used this exact same blueprint to eradicate polio or malaria or the flu?
That is the crucial caveat to this entire historical narrative. If we connect this victory to the bigger picture of global public health, we have to understand that the smallpox campaign is not a simple copy-paste template. Smallpox possessed a very specific set of biological characteristics that made it uniquely vulnerable to eradication.
Okay, let's examine the biology of that vulnerability. What were the specific biological locks that allowed us to trap this virus but failed to trap others?
The most critical factor is the host range. Smallpox was an exclusively human pathogen. It only lived and replicated inside human beings. There was no animal reservoir.
Why is an animal reservoir a deal breaker for eradication?
Think about a disease like malaria, which uses mosquitoes as a vector, or the flu, which constantly circulates and mutates in bird and pig populations. If a virus can hide in an animal population, it doesn't matter if you manage to vaccinate every single human on Earth.
It'll just wait us out.
The virus will simply survive in the animals, mutate over time, and jump back into the human population the moment our immunity wanes. Smallpox had nowhere to hide. If it wasn't actively burning through a human host, it died.
That's a massive biological weakness. We didn't have to vaccinate every mammal on Earth, just the humans.
Exactly. Secondly, smallpox lacked a subclinical or asymptomatic phase that could secretly spread the virus. If you had smallpox, you showed unmistakable physical symptoms, the fever, and then the very distinct rash.
There's no silent spreaders.
You didn't need a complex laboratory PCR test to confirm a case. A health worker could diagnose it visually with near-perfect accuracy. This visibility is what made the surveillance and containment strategy possible. You could literally see the fire burning.
If the virus can't spread silently, you can always track its path.
Furthermore, the virus was biologically stable. It didn't rapidly mutate its outer proteins the way influenza or COVID-19 does. This meant that the vaccine Jenner developed in 1796 was still effectively targeting the virus in 1977.
That's amazing.
And when you administered that vaccine, it provided robust, long-lasting immunity. So we were fighting a highly visible enemy with no animal reservoirs to hide in, using a perfectly stable weapon.
So the biological stars were perfectly aligned. But even with all of those inherent advantages, reading through the source material, you realize the campaign was never a guaranteed success.
Not at all.
It nearly collapsed multiple times due to funding shortages, monsoon seasons wiping out roads, and health workers trying to negotiate truces in civil wars just to deliver vaccines.
It was a razor-thin victory. And it's important to clarify that while the disease is eradicated from the wild, the virus itself is not entirely extinct from the physical universe.
Right, we have this caged threat. The sources confirm that 2 highly guarded frozen samples of the variola virus remain in existence today, kept alive for research and defensive purposes in case of a synthetic biological attack.
One sample is held at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, in the United States. The other is held at the Victor Institute in Koltsovo, Russia.
The 2 geopolitical superpowers of the Cold War, who put aside their nuclear brinkmanship to defeat this virus, are now the only entities on Earth still holding the last remnants of the enemy they defeated together. There is a deep, unsettling poetry to that reality.
It is unsettling, and it underscores a larger tragedy that the sources allude to, the tragedy of forgetting.
The forgetting.
This monumental event, this unparalleled triumph of human willpower, strategy, and cooperation, has largely slipped into the background noise of modern memory. If you walk down the street and ask people to name the date smallpox was eradicated, or to explain ring vaccination, or to identify D.A. Henderson or William Foge, most would have absolutely no idea.
We have mistaken the profound quiet of the victory for proof that there was never a war in the first place. The very fact that parents today don't have to withhold names from their infants, the fact that we don't even have to think about smallpox, is the physical proof of the victory. But that same safety is exactly what causes us to forget the sacrifices of the hundreds of thousands of unnamed health workers who bought us this peace.
And forgetting that history can foster a dangerous complacency. It can fool us into believing that global health security is a natural state of being, rather than a fragile construct maintained by rigorous science, relentless public health strategy, and unprecedented international cooperation.
So synthesizing everything we've pulled from the sources today, we are looking at an arc that almost defies belief. We started with a biological combination lock that haunted human civilization for at least 3 millennia. An entity that killed an estimated 300 million people in just a fraction of its existence.
Yeah.
And we traced how a deeply fractured global community, staring down the very real threat of mutual nuclear annihilation, decided to forge a parallel path. They shared resources, invented new logistical tools like the bifurcated needle, abandoned failing mass strategies for precise ring vaccination, and hunted this pathogen into a corner.
From 300 million dead to absolute zero. Forever.
It stands as the most undeniable factual proof in the historical record that when human beings decide to execute a shared vision, even when those humans represent bitter geopolitical enemies, they possess the capacity to achieve the genuinely impossible.
It is the ultimate historical counterargument to modern cynicism.
Which leaves us with a critical, somewhat provocative question as we look at the world today. If the eradication of smallpox proves definitively that political rivals can completely neutralize an existential threat when they share resources, knowledge, and a single unified goal, what other impossible global challenges are we currently just managing?
That is a phenomenal lens to view the present through. Consider the massive structural threats of our era, the logistics of climate change mitigation, the persistent grinding reality of extreme global poverty, the looming threat of future pandemics with respiratory pathogens.
Are we currently just deploying the equivalent of the early 19th century cowpox vaccine against these issues?
Are we merely playing defense, managing the outbreaks, and accepting the casualties as unavoidable background noise?
We are settling for containment when we have the proven historical capacity for eradication.
Exactly. The source material forces us to ask, what structural terrors could we be permanently erasing from the human experience right now if we demanded that our leaders deploy that exact same level of collective, borderless willpower today?
It forces a complete recalibration of what we accept as normal. There is a terror your ancestors lived with every single day of their lives that you have never felt, simply because humanity made a conscious decision that you shouldn't have to. It leaves you wondering, what terrors are we casually living with today that our descendants shouldn't have to feel?
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a moment to truly appreciate the quiet of the victory today.